This is a list of the default lifecycle phases, and the default lifecycle is the primary lifecycle of Maven and is used to build the application. Sometimes it's also known as the build lifecycle. As you can see from the list, it has 23 phases. The phases highlighted in yellow are the ones that already have plugins or goals bound to them. Different Maven goals will be bound to different phases of the Maven lifecycle depending on the type of packaging. For example, the package phase for a jar will have a different goal bound to it than that of a raw packaging type. Also, when a phase is called via Maven command, for example mvn compile, only phases up to and including that phase will be executed. So just to emphasize, it's not just the compile phase that will be run. It will be first of all a validate, then the initialize, followed by generate sources, process sources, generate resources, process resources, and then the compile. It won't be just the compile phase on its own. This is quite a list to remember. We already have something that can help us here. We have the help plugin. So whenever we need to refresh our memory or we need to see exactly what goals are being run, we can run that from Maven within Eclipse. And that's what we're going to do next. So let's cut across to Eclipse now. In the previous tutorials, we used the help plugin. Well, here we're going to do a similar thing, only we can actually use the help plugin to give us information about a specific phase or the goal that has been bound to that phase. So as we did before, if we select the project, right click, go to Run As, down to Maven Build with the 3 dots. And then again we need the name of the plugin, which is help, colon and the goal, which is describe. Parameter. What we're asking here is basically for the help plugin to run a describe goal, but the parameter we're passing in this time isn't the lifecycle, it's actually the name of a phase, which is compile. So if we run that, we'll see what we get. So this is showing the binding between the phase and the goal. The phase being compile, and the goal in this case being the Maven compiler plugin with a goal of compile. The actual goal itself is here, and the plugin it belongs to is the Maven compiler plugin version 251. We can also see from the console output that the POM packaging type is set to jar. So in other words, the default Maven lifecycle has been configured for the jar packaging type. So when the build is invoked, Maven knows that it needs to build and package up a jar file as opposed to any other type of archive file, like a WAR file. We can take a closer look at the output and see what other information it gives us. What's being output are the 23 phases of the default lifecycle. As you can see, not all the phases have bindings. What do I mean by binding? Well, basically it's a mapping between a phase and a goal. So for example, if we look at the validate, the very first phase at the top, separated by a colon, the not defined is basically saying nothing's being defined, nothing has been bound to that particular phase. There isn't a goal mapped to that phase. But if we go a bit further down to the first goal that's been mapped, which is a process resources, we have process resources, which is the phase, again separated by the colon. But this is different. It actually has something defined or bound to it. And this is the resources goal. What this does basically, the resources goal, it copies resources files, properties files from the source directory into the target directory. It's quite a basic goal, but the implementation of that goal is actually done within a plugin, and its current version is 2.6. This is the default configuration out the box that Maven provides us. There's no reason why we can't override this goal or actually provide a goal for one of these empty slots. For example, generate resources. In this project, we don't have any requirement to generate source code, but there are many projects that do. So currently it stands as not defined or as an empty slot. Just want to quickly walk through the goals that are actually assigned to phases for the packaging type of jar. We've got, as we discussed, process resources. which basically moves the resources from the source directories into the target directories for compilation. And then we have the Maven compiler plugin goal, which does the compiling of source code. And then pretty much it's blank all the way down till we get to the process test resources. What that does, similar to the last process resources, only it's actually processing the resources or properties files for our test suite or our unit tests. We've got the test compile goal, which is assigned to the test compile phase, and that compiles our test code and moves it to the target directory for testing. And then we have the test phase, which actually invokes our unit tests, for example JUnit. And then an interesting phase here called packaging. This actually takes everything we've built and compiled and it builds it into an archive file, in this case a jar. We've got the jar goal there. What we're going to do next is have a look at how we can change the package phase to use a different goal. But first I just want to talk about the last two phases that actually have a goal assigned to them. We've got install. This basically takes your newly created archive file and that installs it into your local Maven repository within the .m2 directory structure. And lastly you have deploy. This is probably different to the actual deploy term you're used to in the development environment, but what it means here is deploying it into a remote repository or a remote Maven repository. Archive file can then be shared across the team or within an organization. Now we're not going to be using deploy, but we'll be looking at running the install phase. Let's return to the packaging type in the POM and see how it affects our default build process. Click the down arrow and go from jar to wall. Okay, we save that. Do a Maven update. So that's Maven update Maven project with the 3 dots. Make sure the project's selected. Hit OK. Web app facet's being applied now to that project. The next step is really just to run the M2 build again. Let's see what we've got. Everything else is the same as before as far as the compile phase is concerned. When we look down here, the lifecycle of the POM packaging is wall. It's no longer jar. Now these first guys are still not defined. The resources plugin's the same as the compile. We skip past the test because they're the same as well. The thing that has changed though is the package phase. This is no longer using a jar goal, it's now using a wall goal. And what that means is that Maven now understands that the project type is of wall, no longer jar. It's now a web application. It's no longer a standard Java application. So that tries to illustrate to you that the build lifecycle is a dynamic thing. It's not static. Although the phases are relatively static and similar across all types of project, the actual bindings to the goals is very much dynamic, and we can customize that and change it ourselves via the POM. And that's what we'll be doing in a couple of tutorials time once we've looked at plugins, what plugins are, how plugins work, and how to invoke a plugin.